Football players that are not being talked about enough ahead of next season. On today's episode of the Locked On Louisville podcast, we're going to be discussing TJ Quinn, Chris Bell, and Popeye Williams. So with that being said, let's get right on into the show.
You are Locked On Louisville, your daily podcast on the Louisville Cardinals. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, what's going on, everyone? Welcome into another episode of the Locked On Louisville podcast. I'm your host, Dalton Pence. I serve as a credential media member for Cardinals Sports Zone. I also do some PA announcing work for the university in various sports. I want to take this time to personally thank you all for making us your first listen of the day. Just a reminder, the Locked On Louisville podcast is free on all streaming services 5 days a week. Your team every day. As I mentioned, we're discussing three Louisville football players that are simply not being talked about enough ahead of next season. That is linebacker TJ Quinn, wide receiver Chris Bell, and edge rusher Popeye Williams. Beginning with TJ Quinn, and before we talk about Quinn and how I think that he's going to have a very solid year, I think it's worth saying that there's a lot of moving pieces to this team, right? There's a lot of newcomers. There's a good amount of players that have departed the program. So it's sort of difficult to sometimes adequately talk about a player in terms of what they're going to do next season. Granted, it's May 30th. So spring ball has ended. There hasn't been a fall camp yet. So really, in all honesty, maybe you can look at a situation like this and say, well, you haven't given it time to talk about these three players. But in all reality, I think that through the spring, through last winter, there really hasn't been a ton of talk about these three guys. And I think that there should be at least more. And I'm going to tell you why. Beginning with TJ Quinn, got a little bit off track, but TJ Quinn had a phenomenal spring game. Now, granted, spring games are not the end-all, be-all. There's not a ton of substance to take away from that game, considering that players are hurt. It's a different type of competition. I mean, you're playing against each other. It's almost half speed. But for what it's worth, TJ Quinn was the star on the defense. He had 8 tackles and an interception for the Cardinals, for a defense that I think Louisville's defense, the red defense, won 51-30. They had 3 interceptions in that game. TJ Quinn, like I said, had one of them. But overall, I think that Quinn is in an interesting situation because not only, I think you have to look at this from position versatility and, availability. We'll start with availability. Simply put, the opportunities there. I probably shouldn't say availability. I should say positional opportunity. Because there's no Monty Montgomery. He transferred to Mississippi. There's no Dorian Jones. He transferred to Cincinnati. And there's no Momo Sanogo, who pursued professional football. So right there, your 3 starting inside linebackers from a season ago are not with the program. So with the program, you currently have a handful of guys that have played sparingly, have tried to separate themselves, like Jalen Alderman. There's Jackson Hamilton. Obviously, TJ Quinn is in the mix there. And then there's some talented newcomers like 4-star freshman Stanquan Clark, who, if you paid attention to the spring game, you feel as if he's going to be a major player for Louisville in the future. And then not to mention, you got a highly talented transfer from Oregon in Keith Brown, who very well could be starting at one of those spots. But I think that regardless if Quinn is a starter or not, he's going to be a player that's going to catch the eyes of Louisville fans early on because of the versatility that he brings to the position. If you don't remember, TJ Quinn was actually recruited as a safety coming out of high school in that Flyville 21 class, a legacy recruit, had a lot of ties to the program. Most people thought that he was going to be a safety, myself included. However, it was determined really since he got to college that, hey, we're going to utilize you as a linebacker, sort of a hybrid. Scott Satterfield and Brian Brown's defense really valued that versatility at that position. We saw a couple players in that role sort of go from a safety to linebacker. I mean, 3 of them in the same class, Ben Perry, Jalen Alderman joined TJ Quinn in that transition. So Perry obviously has played a decent amount. Alderman played when Monty Montgomery went down in 2021. But TJ Quinn really hasn't gotten a lot of run just yet. He had 9 solo tackles last year, 18 total. So, I mean, he got a little bit of playing time. Redshirt sophomore from Valdosta, Georgia, 6 foot, 225 pounds. Obviously gained some weight. Obviously, and I think that when you watch his high school film, you see sort of those linebacker tendencies that allow you to understand why he was being projected more of as a linebacker than as a safety. But I think that his ability to get after the opposing ball carrier while also being respectable in coverage as well, it does beg the question, well, what is the situation going to look like with the new 4-2-5 defense? And I feel like I keep bringing that up, but it's a very valid point because we have to really understand, or to understand how a player is going to fit in the defense, we have to see it first, and we have to understand their fit in the scheme, things of that nature. So I think that Keith Brown is going to be one of those players that starts at the linebacker position for Louisville. Outside of that, maybe there's not necessarily that opportunity that there was with Scott Satterfield's defense, just considering the different base package where you're playing more defensive backs than you are linebackers. But I think TJ Quinn, who had a very solid spring from the people that I've talked to, I talked to various people who said that Quinn consistently impressed. He was a player that obviously showed out in the spring game, a guy that has a couple years under his belt playing against ACC players, and now, being able to get his body to where he wants it to be, playing the linebacker position. I think that this is one to watch for that we need to be paying attention to, because linebacker is sort of up in the air at the moment, because you could make the case that, hey, maybe we should be talking more about Jalen Alderman. Maybe we should be talking more about KJ Cloyd. Maybe Jackson Hamilton's a guy we should be discussing more. We obviously talk about Stanquan Clark and Keith Brown a lot, but outside of that, there's not a lot of talk outside of the linebacker room. So I think TJ Quinn is a name that when I was sort of doing my homework for this hypothetical argument, I kept circling his name because of what people were telling me over the past couple months, what I've heard from inside of the Louisville program, from people just saying that, he looks like a guy who's going to be able to come in and potentially be a starter next season. I know that before the spring, myself included, one of the positions that I felt like Louisville really needed to address was that linebacker position, because I worried about the returning pieces, the lack of experience from a whole season standpoint, and the lack of productivity at that position just made me wonder. I do like the addition of Keith Brown. I love that the Cardinals held on to the commitment of Stanquan Clark, but I still felt like in January or February that Louisville needed to add another guy. And from what I've heard, maybe that isn't necessarily the case here, because the staff is very high on Clark. They're very high on Brown. They're very high on Hamilton, Cloyd, Alderman, and TJ Quinn. But I think TJ Quinn's the one we need to focus on the most, because of not only that versatility to potentially play in a defensive back role, but also I think that it's starting to show in spring ball. And he's a player that we really need to keep an eye out on in the fall camp, heading into that first game against Georgia Tech, going back and playing in his home state in Georgia. I think would be a pretty solid opportunity for him to start right away. So I think that, he's a player that I've circled. I like the ability to get after the opposing ball carrier. I do think he has an underrated ability to get after the opposing quarterback as well. Not necessarily a huge pass rusher, obviously being an inside linebacker, but I do think that when you watch the film at the high school level, he did show tendencies to be able to use that explosiveness and athleticism for being 6 foot 225. And it seems like with him adding weight, he hasn't lost that step or that speed either. So that's something that's encouraging moving forward. And then obviously the interception as well shows that coverage ability that he had in high school might allow him to be used in more versatile ways in the 4-2-5 base defensive package. So just wanted to focus on here. Obviously, you have to convince yourself when talking about players that need to be talked about more. And I think that TJ Quinn is one that you all, I say, all Louisville fans, not just the ones listening to the show, we need to, start looking at TJ Quinn a little bit more when it comes to potential standouts in 2023. So, moving right on along, we'll talk about another guy. That is wide receiver Chris Bell, who did not play in the spring due to injury, but you still should not sleep on him ahead of next season. We'll talk about Bell here in just a moment after we talk about our friends over at Built Bar. If you're looking for a delicious snack but don't want all the sugar and calories, then you need to try the best tasting protein bar on the market. Built is the best. You get the best of both worlds. Go to Built.com, scroll down to the macros chart, and see for yourself how it's just as good as a protein bar. And then when you open the wrapper, you see that it is covered in 100% real chocolate, so it tastes just like a candy bar as well. So there you go, the best of both worlds. It has a wide variety of flavor: peanut butter brownie, churro, cookies and cream, so on and so forth. And accessibility has never been easier. Usually you've had to get them at Built.com. Now it's a game changer. Go to Walmart. You can go to the pharmacy section, get a 4-bar box of your favorite flavors. Or if you like Sam's Club, you can go there as well. 13-bar boxes available at Sam's Club. So be sure to take advantage of all the opportunities, all the variety, and the best tasting and healthy protein bar on the market right now. That is Built Bar. You need to try it now. All right, heading on into the second segment of the show, discussing 3 Louisville Cardinals football players that aren't being talked about enough ahead of next season. The season just about, 95 days away, give or take? So we're far away from it, but we're not, because it'll get here sooner than you know it. We just talked about TJ Quinn and why he is one to watch on the defense. We're not done talking about the defense. Stay tuned for the third segment of the show, but I want to now go into the offensive side of the ball. Chris Bell is a player that I've been, pretty vocal about in terms of, my belief that he's going to be a very good player for Louisville. Last season, as a true freshman, played behind Tyler Hudson, played behind Amari Huggins-Bruce, Braden Smith, so on and so forth. The Louisville offense, passing-wise, just never really truly got it going. But he made a little bit of a mark. He had 7 catches for 105 yards. He probably could have done a little bit more, but every single game that he appeared in, he recorded a catch, had a catch against South Florida, Boston College, Pittsburgh, 2 against Wake Forest, 1 against James Madison, and then 1 in the bowl game in the Wasabi Fenway Bowl against Cincinnati, but never really got an opportunity to showcase his skill set. The 6'2", 220-pound receiver from Yazoo City, Mississippi, was a player coming out of high school that late in the game, he was ranked outside of the top 1,000, but both Mississippi and Mississippi State were trying to get in this recruitment. Louisville ended up winning out, but nonetheless, the in-state interest was there. And that's something that I think was pretty encouraging when I looked at the ranking, because, you look at rankings and you say, well, not every player can be a diamond in the rough type prospect. And that is true. But I like to look at the film. I like to look at the offer sheets. And I thought that Chris Bell had an offer sheet that was, reminiscent of a player ranked higher than what was he, 1,200 or something like that, give or take. But didn't necessarily get a lot of opportunity to showcase what he had last year. Now, move along to this year. Tyler Hudson goes to the NFL. You lose D. Wiggins and Braden Smith and Chance Morrow to the transfer portal. However, Jeff Brom does what Jeff Brom does. That is reload an offense. And the Cardinals went out and they got some possible ready level guys. Jamari Thrash, the best receiver in the Sun Belt, who is going to play a role like Tyler Hudson did here, to where he's probably going to be the number 1 option. You bring back Amari Huggins-Bruce. You also bring in another speed guy like Kevin Coleman Jr. from Jackson State, who had 500 yards as a true freshman for the Tigers under Coach Deion Sanders, and was a highly rated guy coming out of high school the previous class. Not only that, but you also went to the transfer portal. You got 2 talented guys, one from Cincinnati, Jaden Thompson, a guy who was a 3rd or 4th option. And then you got a very talented player in Jimmy Callaway from Tennessee, who had some off-the-field issues that kind of deterred his season last year, but the talent is there. No debating that. On top of that, you brought in a handful of receivers in the Flyville 23 class. 4-star receiver from the Miami area, William Fowles, who tore it up at the Under Armour All-American camp this past winter. Kataris Hicks from the Miami area as well, who you looked really good in spring ball. And then you also have Jaleel McClain from out in California, the Flyville 23 prospect. Cali to the Ville, played at St. John Bosco. So you have options at the wide receiver core. So one thing that I will say, as much as I do believe that he is a player to watch, it's also going to be tough to, compete for, targets in this offense when there's so many mouths to feed at the receiver position. However, two things I think work to Chris Bell's advantage. Number one, the difference in types of receivers. When you look at the top guys projected for Louisville this upcoming year, Kevin Coleman Jr. and Amari Huggins-Bruce are both speed guys, guys that are going to be playing in the slot. Jamari Thrash, I think he's 6'6", maybe. I probably could have confirmed that before I started recording this episode. Jamari Thrash is 6 foot. So a guy that could play either in the slot or out wide. But he's probably going to be the number one receiver at Louisville next season. Granted, what Brian Brom and company do is they make it very interesting. They make it complicated for defenses to figure out their offense by switching receivers around, putting them in different situations to succeed. I think that Chris Bell, being 6'2", having that size, having that athleticism for his size, he poses a different option than, say, Kevin Coleman Jr. or Amari Huggins-Bruce. You're not going with true speed guys, but more of, sturdier guys that can win near the goal line, win in short field situations, jump ball situations. So I think the differentiation in skill set is something that works to his advantage, and that's something that, not having those types of guys, not having a D. Wiggins, not having a Chance Morrow, not bringing Tyler Hudson back, or not, that doesn't sound right. Tyler Hudson declared for the NFL draft, so it wasn't necessarily Louisville's option, but Tyler Hudson not coming back, I think, opens up opportunities for Chris Bell to see the field in a different capacity. There also has been rumors that Louisville may look to use Chris Bell in tight end situations, which I think is genius. Now, not to say that he's going to be an every down blocker for Louisville, because I don't necessarily think that's going to be the case. But if you line him up in tight end situations where he's going to be a pass catcher, obviously Jeff Brom and company have done a great job of utilizing tight ends in his offenses, both at Purdue, but also Western Kentucky as well. There is the issue of, who is the tight end for Louisville next season? Is it Joey Gatewood, a guy who never has caught a pass before? Is it true freshman Jamari Johnson? Is it walk-on Josh Lipson? Is it Nate Kuriski, who has not played a big role for this team? So you have opportunity there, and potentially if you look at Chris Bell as a player that says, okay, look, you've got options at wide receiver, and we know that Chris Bell wants or needs to see the field as well, because he is good enough to see the field, and we would like to utilize the mismatch that is his size and his athleticism. Let's line him up in tight end situations as a pass catcher and make this offense really dynamic. And if that is confirmed, obviously I don't know, but if that comes true, if that comes to light and that happens, I can only imagine what the opportunities are like for Chris Bell and company. So, or for Louisville's offense and Chris Bell, I should say, both parties. But I think it opens up opportunities for Chris Bell to see the field, to see a bigger role in this offense. I think that he would obviously need to gain some weight to consistently play the tight end position. Is that something that, Jeff Brom and company are potentially looking to do for the next couple of years? That I don't know. I think that maybe could just be for him to see the field. But I think lining him up in tight end at certain situations could be something that works out exponentially for Louisville. It seems like tight ends nowadays, it's all about trying to find that mismatch. You have guys that can run just as fast as defensive backs, guys that focus more on receiving than blocking, which Scott Satterfield mainly recruited guys that were better blockers than receivers. Jeff Brom seems to be the exact opposite, and you see that in going out and getting a guy like Joey Gatewood, who you're banking on that athleticism. Potentially, you're doing the same thing with Chris Bell. That's something to focus on. I think that's something that, as Louisville fans, we need to look at this situation. I think Chris Bell is good enough to play here at Louisville. I think he's good enough to start here at Louisville. Is that going to be next season? Who knows? Is he going to play a good amount? Potentially. I think he's one to watch for because of the sheer talent. Now, granted, he did miss spring ball due to an injury, so that kind of hurts him, but hopefully he's going to be back and fully healthy for fall camp and going into next season. So some to watch for here, moving forward. But the last player we'll talk about as we go back to the defensive side of the ball is edge rusher Popeye Williams. I think that he could be one of the biggest standouts for this Louisville team in 2023. We'll explain why. Before we do that, I want to thank you all again for making us your first listen of the day. Just a reminder, the Locked On Louisville podcast is free on all streaming services, 5 days a week, your team every day. So moving on into the final segment of the show, like I mentioned, Popeye Williams, the final, but obviously not least, the last but not least player that we're going to talk about, 3 Louisville Cardinal football players that aren't being talked about enough ahead of next season. I think of the 3, of TJ Quinn, Chris Bell, and Popeye Williams, Williams is probably talked about more of the 3 just because of his high school ranking. Popeye Williams was a top 200 player, the best player in the Flyville 22 class, very, very talented edge rusher from Westfield, Indiana, a player that didn't necessarily play a lot last season, and I think a lot of that's due to having Yasir Abdullah playing in front of him, Yaya Diaby playing in front of him, Ashton Gelati playing in front of him. It's kind of one of those wait your turn type situations, not necessarily indicative of the talent, but more so indicative of the opportunity at hand, a log-jammed rotation ahead of him. He only recorded 3 total tackles this past season for the Cardinals, recorded 1 each against NC State, James Madison, and Pittsburgh. But I do think that this is a year to where I think Williams has the opportunity. Like I said, 6'3", 233 pounds. Now you have no Yasir Abdullah, you have no Yaya Diaby. So the question now is he projecting more of an outside linebacker role or a traditional defensive end? I think he's probably more so at very best a weak side defensive end, but I think outside linebacker is a role that he could be filling, that Yasir Abdullah role. Obviously, he has to compete with a player like Stephen Herron, the transfer from Stanford, hometown player from Trinity that spent a couple years at Stanford, graduated, and now is a grad transfer here at Louisville. Ashton Gelati is going to man one side of the defense. It'll be interesting to see who that other defensive end is opposite of Gelati in the new 4-2-5 defense. But I do think that regardless of if he starts or not, Popeye Williams is a player that's going to play a ton of meaningful snaps in 2023, not only because of the opportunity, but because of the talent at hand. Like TJ Quinn, he is a player that I've heard great things about through spring. He led the Cardinals defense with 2 tackles for loss in that spring game. Like I said, can't look too much into that, take too many takeaways from that, but still significant in itself to talk about. So like TJ Quinn, he's another player that I've heard from multiple people that have said, hey, look, don't take your eye off this guy because he's a player that, right away could make a solid impact, a player that is solid at forcing turnovers that we've seen at the high school level, does a great job with his length and athleticism to really bully opposing offensive linemen and get into the opposing backfield, make it tough for quarterbacks to operate with that speed that he possesses, and I think, continuing to add strength. I want to look at his recruiting profile to see a comparison. I want to see, okay, in high school, he was listed as being 6'3", 230. Now he's 6'3", 233. I'm not sure if that's going to be, if that's an updated number. But Alan True of 24/7 Sports, a national recruiting analyst there, compared him to Hassan Reddick of the Philadelphia Eagles, pass rusher who utilizes a ton of twitch, a ton of explosiveness and speed off the edge, while also combining that with a ton of strength as well. A player that I think could definitely, be a guy that could catch the ACC by storm. I think that continuing to be in the collegiate weight room for a year, being able to play to the speed of ACC ball, having that year under his belt of college development, I really, really am excited to see what Popeye does. I understand sometimes it's easy to sort of look past him when you talk about guys like Ashton Gelati and Stephen Herron and some guys in that secondary, but make no mistake about it. When you mention this Louisville pass rush, do not forget about a guy like Popeye Williams, because if you remember, Ashton Gelati, as a true freshman, was a guy who didn't necessarily start a ton, but he made an impact when his number was called. I think that could be the same trajectory of a player like Popeye Williams. So he's one to keep an eye out on, while also keeping an eye out on TJ Quinn and Chris Bell, 3 players overall that are not being talked about enough for the Louisville football team ahead of the 2023 season. So tomorrow's episode of the show, we're going to talk about the athlonsports.com preseason all ACC teams. Who could make those teams for Louisville? Be sure to stay tuned, but that's going to wrap up today's episode of the show. Everyone have a great day. We'll see you right back here very soon.